Have you ever felt completely safe? That warm, blanket-like feeling when you're walking down a familiar street, under the soft yellow glow of the streetlights, and you think that nothing in the world can harm you? Hold on to that feeling, memorize it, because in the next 30 seconds, I'm going to take it away from you. The story you're about to hear isn't a nightmare. It's worse. It's real. It happened on a street just as quiet as the one you might be on right now, to a woman who believed in safety just like you did, until that night. By the way, where are you listening to this from? And what time is it for you? Let me know your time zone and what you're doing in the comments below. I want to know at what moment of your day my story reached you. And trust me, you need to stay until the very end, because the truth hidden behind this confrontation will make you question everything you thought you knew about courage and betrayal. It wasn't just a confrontation, it was a meticulously crafted psychological war. The orange glow of the streetlights poured a liquid honey onto the quiet sidewalks of the Oak Creek neighborhood. It was one of those picture-perfect suburbs you see on postcards advertising the American dream. Manicured lawns, quaint brick houses with white picket fences, and a silence so profound it was only broken by the chirping of crickets in the bushes. For Dr. Alani Freeman, a 34-year-old sociologist, this nightly walk was her meditation. Every evening, after a long day of researching and teaching about social bonds, she and Kaiser, her German shepherd, would trace this same familiar path. Tonight was no different. The crisp autumn air seeped through Alani's light jacket, carrying the scent of damp leaves and rich earth. She took a deep breath, letting the peace soak into her bones. Beside her, Kaiser moved with a silent dignity. He was no ordinary pet. Kaiser was a veteran, a retired military working dog who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. His body was a solid block of disciplined muscle, every step radiating focus and awareness. His ears were always perked, his amber eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, not with fear, but with the practiced assessment of a professional soldier. Alani felt the slight tension on the leash in her hand. It wasn't the pull of an eager dog, but a subtle signal, a non-verbal communication that flowed between them. Her bond with Kaiser went far beyond the typical owner-pet relationship. They were partners. She had adopted him through a special program for retired MWDs, helping them decompress from combat and reintegrate into civilian life. It hadn't been easy. Alani had spent months learning his commands, his signals, his entire worldview, which had been shaped by the crucible of war. She learned that for Kaiser, silence didn't mean peace. It meant waiting. Control wasn't submission, it was strength. They turned the corner onto Elm and Birch, the quietest stretch of their route, only 3 more blocks to the warmth and safety of her home. She smiled, patting Kaiser's neck. "Almost home, boy," she whispered. The dog responded with a gentle nudge against her leg, a rare and cherished display of affection. That's when she saw it. At the far end of the street, a police cruiser rolled slowly, its lights off, almost drifting through the darkness like a shark. Alani's heart gave a little jolt. It was an involuntary reaction, a reflex etched into the subconscious of every black person in America, regardless of their wealth, their education, their zip code. The presence of police didn't always bring a sense of safety. Sometimes it was the harbinger of a nameless danger. She tried to dismiss the unease. "I'm doing nothing wrong," she told herself. "I'm walking my dog in my own neighborhood. Everything is fine." She tightened her grip on the leash and continued walking at a normal pace, feigning an air of indifference. But the car kept coming, its slowness deliberate. Its headlights swept across the sleeping houses before locking onto her. The blinding glare forced Alani to squint, turning her and Kaiser into 2 lonely silhouettes on an impromptu stage. The car stopped about 30 feet away. The engine remained on, a low guttural growl in the still night. The driver's side door opened, and a large figure emerged. He was backlit, but Alani could make out the imposing shape of a tall, heavy-set man in a police uniform. The passenger door opened as well, and a second, younger and thinner officer got out and leaned against the car, crossing his arms. The large officer started walking toward her. Each footstep on the asphalt sounded like a hammer blow. Kaiser, who had been trotting calmly by her side, was now stock still. His entire body was tense, coiled like a spring. He didn't growl, he didn't bark. He just stood there, a living statue of pure focus, his eyes locked on the approaching man. Alani could feel a low vibration humming from Kaiser's body, up the leash and into her hand. It was contained energy, immense power held in check by iron discipline. "Good evening, ma'am," the officer said, his voice flat but carrying an unnerving chill. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough for Alani to see his face in the streetlight. It was a pale, hard face with small, glittering eyes and a mouth that turned down in a condescending half-smile. "Good evening, officer," Alani replied, forcing her voice to be calm and respectful. She had seen countless videos, heard countless lectures from her father. Always be calm, always be respectful. Don't give them a reason. "What are you doing out here this time of night?" the officer asked, his eyes flicking from Alani to Kaiser and back to Alani in an open, assessing gaze. "I'm walking my dog," Alani answered. "I live just down the street." The officer, whose name she would later learn was Miller, gave a small, disbelieving snort. "Walking? Looks more like lurking to me. We got a call about a suspicious person in the area." The words were an invisible knife. Suspicious person. The all-too-familiar code. Alani knew exactly what it meant. It meant a black person in a place we don't think you belong. This neighborhood, with its predominantly white and wealthy residents, was clearly one of those places in this officer's mind. "Officer, I can assure you I'm not suspicious," Alani said, her voice still a mask of composure. "I'm Dr. Alani Freeman. I'm a resident of this neighborhood." Miller smirked. "A doctor, huh? Anybody can say that." He glanced at Kaiser, who remained frozen, ominously silent. "That's a big dog. Looks mean." "He's well-trained," Alani replied, choosing her words with surgical precision. "Trained or starved to be mean," Miller shot back, his tone dripping with provocation. That's when Alani knew this wasn't a routine stop. This wasn't about community safety. This was a power play, a drama in which she had been unwillingly cast in the lead role. And the officer before her wasn't just a lawman. He was a racist looking for an excuse, a reason to turn her peaceful night into a waking nightmare. The confrontation had just begun, and in the honey-colored darkness, a war without guns was about to unfold. The silence stretched for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. In that void, Alani could hear her own heart, a frantic drumbeat against the deathly stillness of Kaiser. She felt her breathing grow shallow. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, a mantra from her childhood. "Control your breath. In for 4, hold for 7, out for 8. It'll slow your heart. It'll keep your mind clear." Alani took a slow, deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs, and let it out even more slowly. Clarity returned, pushing back the initial fog of fear. She had to think, not react. Every word, every gesture was being weighed. The second officer, Davis, the younger one, remained by the patrol car. He said nothing, just watched, his face a mask of shadows. His silence was a weapon too, a form of quiet complicity with Miller's aggression. He was part of the wall she was facing. "Let me see your ID," Miller commanded, his voice no longer a question but a flat order. Alani knew her rights. She wasn't required to show ID unless she was driving or reasonably suspected of a specific crime. Lurking was a flimsy, subjective pretext, but she also knew that arguing her rights at this moment could be twisted into non-compliance, which would only escalate the situation. It was a dangerous chess match, and she had to choose her move wisely. "Of course, officer," she said, her voice slow and deliberate. "My wallet is in my jacket pocket. I'm going to reach for it slowly. My hands will be in your sight the entire time." She did exactly as she said she would. Shifting Kaiser's leash to her left hand, She moved her right hand slowly toward her jacket pocket. Every movement was telegraphed, non-threatening. She could feel Miller's eyes fixed on her hand. Finally, her fingers closed around the familiar leather of her wallet. She carefully pulled it out and flipped it open to her driver's license. As she held the card out to Miller, he didn't take it. Instead, his gaze snapped back to Kaiser. "Get a hold of your dog," he growled. "It looks like it's about to attack." Alani glanced at Kaiser. The dog hadn't moved a millimeter. His posture was still one of perfect, controlled alertness. Ears pricked, eyes focused, but with zero signs of aggression. No growl, no bared teeth. He was the epitome of discipline. Miller didn't see discipline. He saw a large, dark-colored dog next to a black woman, and in his mind, that combination equaled danger. "Kaiser," Alani said, her voice a single, low, even-toned word. "Sits." Instantly, as if a switch had been flipped, the 100-pound block of muscle that was Kaiser sank smoothly and silently to the ground. He sat, his back ramrod straight, head held high, his amber eyes still locked on Miller. It wasn't the action of a submissive pet, it was the compliance of a soldier. The precision and speed of the movement seemed to take Miller by surprise. Alani offered her ID again. "He's sitting, officer. He's not going to do anything." Miller snatched the card from her hand, his eyes still laced with suspicion. He shone his flashlight on the card, then on Alani's face, comparing them. "Dr. Alani Freeman," he read aloud, his tone thick with sarcasm. "Address 2 Warform Birch Street, so you were telling the truth." "I told you I was," Alani replied, keeping her voice devoid of emotion. "Doesn't mean you're not up to something," Miller said, handing the card back. He didn't step back. Instead, he took a small step to the side, trying to get a better look at Kaiser in the dark. "These dogs, German shepherds, they can be unpredictable. A lot of attacks involve this breed." "Any dog can be unpredictable if not properly trained and socialized," Alani countered, her voice soft but firm. "Kaiser has had professional training." "Professional?" Miller scoffed. "Professional at what? Mauling people?" The provocation was becoming more blatant. Alani felt a hot flash of anger begin to smolder in her chest, but she extinguished it immediately. Anger was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Anger would be the excuse Miller was searching for. "No, officer," she said. "He was trained for protection and obedience." "Protection? Protection from who?" Miller asked, his voice dropping, carrying an undercurrent of threat. "From the police?" There it was. The trap. Miller was trying to back her into a corner, to force her to admit to some hostile intent. Any answer could be twisted. If she said, "from criminals," he could spin it to, "so you think we're criminals?" If she stayed silent, it could be taken as an admission. Alani chose a different path. She didn't answer his question directly. Instead, she shifted the focus. "Officer, am I breaking any laws?" she asked calmly. "If not, may I please continue home? It's getting late." The direct question seemed to throw Miller off for a second. He had no legal grounds to detain her. He'd verified her identity and address. There was no crime, but the power he wielded didn't always need legal grounds. It just needed someone willing to abuse it. Miller stared at her, his small eyes narrowing. "We'll decide when you can go." He turned to his young partner. "Davis, run the plates on some of these houses, see if anything comes up." It was a nonsense order, a way to stall, a way to assert control. Davis, who had been silent the whole time, hesitated for a fraction of a second. Alani could see it in the slight pause before he turned and walked back toward the cruiser. With Davis's back turned, Miller took another step toward Alani and Kaiser. He was only a few feet away now. The stale scent of cigarettes and coffee wafted from him. "I don't like your attitude, Doctor," he whispered, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "You think you're smarter than me, don't you? With your degree and your war dog." Alani didn't respond. She just stood there, her hand tight on the leash, her heart a block of ice. She felt Kaiser's tension ratchet up another notch. The dog was still sitting, but his body was now like a spring, compressed to its absolute limit. His wall of silence was their strongest defense. Kaiser was reading the situation, processing every micro-signal, Miller's tone, his scent, Alani's own tension. He was waiting for a command or for a direct physical threat. And Alani knew that with a man like Miller, that threat could come at any second. The quiet night in Oak Creek had become a psychological battlefield, and she and her dog were surrounded. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Miller stood there, a figure of malevolent authority, savoring the discomfort he was creating. He didn't need to draw his weapon or his cuffs. His weapons for now were his words, his gaze, his overwhelming presence. He was waging a campaign of psychological warfare, and Alani was the sole target. "You know," Miller continued, his voice still a conspiratorial whisper, "we have laws about dangerous dogs. A dog of this size and breed showing aggression, we have the right to deal with it." "Deal with it?" Alani repeated, her own voice like ice. She knew exactly what he was implying. "That's right, if we feel it's a threat to officer safety or public safety," Miller said, emphasizing every word, "we can neutralize that threat." It was a naked threat, a threat aimed at the one thing most precious to Alani in that moment, Kaiser. Miller was deliberately poking at her weak spot, trying to shatter her composure. He wanted to see her fear, her panic, her begging. That would be his victory. But Alani wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Instead of fear, a cold clarity washed over her. The situation had moved beyond simple harassment. This was real danger, and she needed to act, not with emotion, but with strategy. "Kaiser has shown no aggression, officer," Alani said, her voice firm and clear, no longer laced with feigned deference, but with a statement of fact. "He has obeyed my command and is sitting perfectly still. He is a retired service animal. His record is immaculate." "Service animal?" Miller scoffed, a nasty sound in the night. "Serving who? Some gang trained to sniff out cops from a mile away?" His words were like poison-tipped needles designed to diminish her, to invalidate every aspect of the life she had worked so hard to build. Her degree, her home, her dog, all of it was being twisted through the grotesque lens of his prejudice. In Miller's world, a black woman couldn't be a successful PhD living in a wealthy neighborhood with a highly trained military dog. There had to be something illicit, something wrong. Alani realized that arguing with him was pointless. Logic and truth had no place in this conversation. This was a clash of two entirely different realities. Hers, based on fact, effort, and discipline, and his, built on hate, prejudice, and the abuse of power. She decided to change tactics. She would no longer play his game. She would create a new one. "Officer Miller," she said, using his name for the first time, a small but deliberate act to show she was paying attention, that she was not intimidated. "You have verified my identity. I am not in violation of any law. You have no probable cause to continue detaining me. Your continued harassment of me and your threats against my animal constitute misconduct, and I want you to know that I am memorizing every detail of this exchange." The shift in Alani's tone seemed to momentarily stun Miller. The submissiveness was gone, replaced by a cold, assertive resolve. But the surprise quickly curdled into rage. Miller's face flushed. "Are you threatening me?" he snarled, taking another half-step forward. He was too close now. Her personal space was violated. She could feel his breath, and so could Kaiser. The dog, still seated, made a sound. It wasn't a bark or a growl. It was a short, sharp huff, a single, powerful exhalation of air forced from the lungs. It was a subtle warning signal that only a trained handler would understand. Simultaneously, his body lowered slightly, the muscles in his shoulders and haunches coiling. He was still sitting, but his posture had shifted from passive alert to spring-loaded readiness. His upper lip quivered just enough to reveal the barest tip of a white canine. "See?" Miller shouted, pointing at Kaiser. "He's getting aggressive. He's about to attack." He took a step back, his right hand moving down toward the holstered gun on his hip. Alani's heart stopped. This was it. The moment she had dreaded. Miller had his excuse. He had successfully provoked Kaiser, and now he could justify whatever came next. But Alani knew Kaiser. She knew his training. He would not attack unless she gave the command or unless the threat to her became immediate and unavoidable. He was on the razor's edge, waiting. "Kaiser," Alani said, her voice sharp as a razor's edge, but still perfectly calm. "Stay." Stand still. Without a flicker of hesitation, the dog instantly ceased the quiver, his lip covering the tooth. His posture relaxed fractionally but remained focused. He didn't retreat, he didn't advance. He simply stood, a living wall between Alani and Miller. That action, the instantaneous and absolute obedience to a command in a moment of extreme stress, was more impressive than any act of aggression could ever be. It showed an astonishing level of control. The young officer, Davis, who had returned from the patrol car, saw it too. He had stopped a few feet away, his eyes wide, staring at the dog. He might not have Miller's prejudice, but he could certainly recognize the difference between a crazed, out-of-control animal and one trained to the highest possible standard. "Take your hand off your weapon, Miller," Alani said, her voice now devoid of any fear. It was pure, cold anger. "You know damn well this dog is not a threat. You are deliberately creating a dangerous situation." Miller didn't take his hand off his holster, but he didn't draw either. He was caught in a stalemate of his own making. He had escalated, but the response from Alani and Kaiser was nothing like he'd expected. They weren't panicked, they weren't aggressive, they were simply in control. He turned, looking toward Davis as if for support. "You see that? It almost attacked me." Davis didn't answer right away. His eyes darted from Miller to Alani to Kaiser, who remained as still as a statue. "He looks pretty well controlled, sir," Davis said, his voice uncertain. That answer seemed to be the final straw for Miller. The backup he expected hadn't come. His own partner was having doubts. His absolute authority was eroding right in front of the woman he was trying to terrorize. That failure twisted into a silent fury. Miller turned back to Alani, his face a mask of hate. He stopped talking. Instead, he started walking toward her, his hands loose at his sides, his fists clenched. The verbal threats were over. Now came the threat of physical violence. And Alani knew that Kaiser's discipline was about to face its ultimate test. The moment Miller started walking toward her, time seemed to slow down. Alani could see every minute detail, the way the muscles in Miller's jaw twitched, the way his eyes narrowed into hateful slits, the way the streetlight glinted off the metal button on his uniform. She felt a change in the air, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. In that split second, a dozen thoughts raced through her mind. Should she scream? Should she run? But run where? And she would never, ever leave Kaiser. Screaming might draw attention, but it could also be interpreted by Miller as a hostile act, giving him more justification to use force. No, she couldn't react on instinct. She had to rely on training, not just Kaiser's training, but her own. The years she had spent learning to remain calm under pressure, to analyze a situation logically, to find the weakness in an opponent's argument. This confrontation wasn't just a street encounter, it was a final exam for everything she'd ever learned. And then she remembered. She remembered the early training sessions with Kaiser, with the ex-Marine K-9 handler, a gruff man named Gunner. "You have to understand," Gunner had told her, "Kaiser isn't a dog. He's a sentient weapon, and like any weapon, his effectiveness depends entirely on his handler. You have to be his commander, not just his owner. In a crisis, your calm is his safety switch. Your calm is his safety switch." The phrase resonated in her mind. Miller was 2 steps away now. He was breaching her final zone of safety. Alani didn't back down. She stood her ground, and she gave a command. It wasn't the attack command. It wasn't fast. The word Kaiser was trained to answer with a controlled explosion of violence. anyone could scream, "Attack!" That's what Miller was expecting, provoking. No, Alani chose something else, something more sophisticated, something that demonstrated absolute chilling control. "Kaiser," she said, her voice as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "Platz." Kaiser's reaction was instantaneous and flawless. Like a phantom, his solid body slid to the pavement without a sound. He lay there, a dark mass on the gray sidewalk, head on his paws, unblinking amber eyes fixed on Miller. His silence and stillness were more frightening than any growl. It said, "I am obeying my commander, but my commander is ordering me to watch you, your every move, and I am 1 millisecond and 1 word away." The act completely shattered Miller's script. He was advancing to intimidate a woman and her aggressive dog. But instead of fear or aggression, he was met with a display of military-grade discipline. It was completely outside his frame of reference. Miller froze, his right foot hovering in mid-step. He looked down at the prone dog, then back up at Alani. The rage on his face was now mixed with confusion and even a flicker of fear. This was not a normal dog, and this was not a normal woman. What the hell was that?" Miller stammered, his confidence evaporating. "That's called obedience, officer," Alani said, her voice rock steady. She felt a wave of power surge through her. She had taken back control, not by screaming or fighting, but by using her opponent's own weapon, psychological intimidation, against him. The young officer, Davis, stood a few paces away, his mouth slightly agape. He'd seen the department's K-9s, but he'd never seen a display of discipline like this from a civilian dog. He could feel the tension, but it was no longer the tension Miller had created. It was a new kind, a tension born of wary respect. Alani decided to press her advantage. She looked Miller directly in the eye. "You have crossed a line, Officer Miller. You have threatened me, threatened my property, and deliberately escalated a non-existent situation. You have no reason to be here. I am now demanding that you and your partner leave immediately." She didn't ask, she demanded, the tone of someone who knows they have the upper hand. "You don't have the right to demand anything from us," Miller snarled, trying to hang on to his last shred of authority. "Oh, I do," Alani replied coldly. "And if you don't leave, my next action will be to call 911 and report that I am being harassed by 2 officers without just cause, and that one of them appears mentally unstable and is threatening the use of force. I will read them your patrol car number and your badge number. I wonder how the dispatcher will react to that." It was a checkmate, a threat that would turn them from the enforcers into the subjects of an internal investigation right there on the scene. It would create an official audio record of the incident, a record that Alani, as the caller, would have access to. Miller was speechless. His face went from red to a pasty white. He had lost, utterly and completely. He had brought a knife to a psychological gunfight, and Alani had brought a cannon. He muttered a curse under his breath, then spun on his heel and strode quickly back to the patrol car without another word. The car door slammed with a sound that echoed in the night. Davis lingered for a second. He looked at Alani, then down at Kaiser, still in his perfect prone position. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, an apology, an acknowledgement. Then he too turned and walked back to the car. Alani stood there, listening to the engine roar to life, the tires squealing as it made a sharp U-turn and sped off into the darkness, leaving her and Kaiser alone on the empty street. The silence returned, but it wasn't the peaceful silence of an hour ago. It was heavy with what had just happened. Adrenaline still coursed through Alani's veins. She looked down at her loyal partner. "Kaiser," she whispered, her voice finally trembling just a little. "Frey." Free, release. The dog lifted his head, looked at her, then slowly rose to his feet, giving a great shake as if to shed the tension. He came close and nudged his head against her hand, a gesture of reassurance. Alani dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around the dog's thick neck, burying her face in his fur. She didn't cry. She just breathed, feeling the solid warmth and strength of the creature that had stood between her and the abyss. They had won, but Alani knew the fight wasn't over. It had just moved to a new phase. As the red taillights of the patrol car disappeared down the street, a quiet descended upon Alani. But it wasn't peace. It was the ringing silence after an explosion, when your ears are still buzzing and you're trying to reorient yourself in a landscape that has been forever changed. Her body began to tremble, a delayed reaction as the adrenaline started to recede, leaving a hollow, cold feeling in its wake. "We did it, boy," she whispered into his ear. "We did it." But the victory tasted bitter. She had defended herself, had pushed back against her aggressors, but she shouldn't have had to. Not here, not on the street she had walked hundreds of times. The violation, the feeling of being treated as an intruder in her own home, had left an invisible scar. Slowly she got to her feet, her legs feeling like lead. She looked around. The Oak Creek neighborhood looked the same. The houses still stood, silent in their sleep, the lawn still pristine under the streetlights. But to Alani, everything was different. The veneer of safety had been stripped away, revealing an ugly truth beneath. She no longer saw quaint houses. She saw dark, silent windows, neighbors who had slept soundly while she fought for her safety and her dignity on their doorstep. Inside, she unclipped Kaiser's leash, and he immediately went to his water bowl and began to drink. A shockingly normal act after such an extraordinary event. Alani stood in the middle of her living room, staring into space. Her house, her sanctuary, suddenly felt insecure. She walked to the window and peered out, pulling the edge of the curtain back slightly. The street was empty. Nothing was out of the ordinary, but she knew the darkness out there now held possibilities she had never truly considered before. Would they come back? Would Miller seek revenge? He knew where she lived. He knew her name. The hate in his eyes was not the kind that simply disappears. Alani pulled out her phone, her hands still shaking slightly. She opened her notes app and began to type. She documented everything, every single detail, the time, the location, the appearance of the two officers, every word, every line of dialogue, Miller's name, which she had seen on his nameplate, Davis's silence, the commands she gave Kaiser, their reactions. She typed until her fingers ached. This, she knew, was her evidence. This was her next weapon. After she finished writing, she sat on the sofa, clutching a pillow. Sleep seemed impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Miller's enraged face, felt the coiled tension of Kaiser under her hand. The echo of the confrontation wasn't just in her mind, it was in her body. Her heart still beat faster than normal. Her muscles were still tense. This was the residue of trauma, a physiological response to a life-threatening situation. No bullet had been fired, no punch had been thrown, but her body had registered it as an attack nonetheless. She thought of her father, a civil rights lawyer who had spent his life fighting monsters like Miller. He had always told her the fight for justice wasn't a sprint, it was a marathon. There would be small victories, but the larger war was always ongoing. Tonight she had won a battle, but the war was still there, lurking in the shadows of quiet streets, in the hearts of men who carried hate like a badge. Alani looked at Kaiser, who was now curled up on the rug beside the sofa, his eyes closed but his ears still twitching occasionally, listening to the sounds of the house. Even in sleep, he was on duty. His presence was an immense comfort. She was not alone in this fight. The decision formed in her mind, hard and clear as a diamond. She would not be silent. She would not let Miller and men like him win by sowing fear. She would turn this horrific experience into something meaningful. She would turn the echo of the night into a voice. Alani stood up, feeling a new sense of purpose rising, banishing the last vestiges of fear. She walked into her study and sat down at her computer. The screen lit up, illuminating her determined face. The battle on the sidewalk may have been over, but the war in the courtroom and in the court of public opinion was just beginning. Alani Freeman was no longer a victim. She had become a warrior, and she had a loyal four-legged ally one who was trained for war, ready to stand by her in every battle to come. That night, in the silence of her house, two veterans, one from the wars of men, one from the wars of animals, prepared for a new fight. The door opened and Mrs. Gable, a small woman with a cloud of white hair and bright, intelligent eyes, looked out at her. "Alani, dear," she said, her voice surprised. "Is everything all right?" "Good morning, Mrs. Gable," Alani began, trying to keep her voice even. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I just wanted to ask a quick question. Last night, around 11 o'clock, did you happen to look out your window?" Mrs. Gable looked at her for a long moment, her bright eyes seeming to see right through her. Then she nodded slowly. "Yes, dear," she said softly. "I saw everything." Alani's heart stopped. You saw?" "I couldn't sleep," Mrs. Gable explained. "I came out for a glass of water and I heard voices. I looked through the blinds." She paused, then continued, her voice filled with a quiet fury. "I saw how that policeman treated you. It was a disgrace. And I saw your dog, Kaiser. What a magnificent creature, the way he sat, then laid down on your command. It was incredible." Alani felt tears welling up in her eyes. She didn't just have a witness. She had an advocate. But then Mrs. Gable said something that left Alani utterly speechless. "And you know, Alani," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "I didn't just watch. I did what the young people do these days." She gave a mysterious little smile. "I took out my phone and I recorded it. I have almost 5 minutes of video of the entire thing." The dawn of truth had arrived, and it had brought with it a weapon more powerful than any testimony. A video, irrefutable proof. Alani Freeman's fight had just gained a decisive advantage. For a moment, Alani couldn't speak. She just stood there staring at Mrs. Gable, trying to process what she had just heard. A video, 5 minutes, the entire thing. It was like a miracle, a twist of fate she would have never dared to dream of. You have it on video?" Alani stammered, her voice a mixture of disbelief and soaring hope. "Yes, dear," Mrs. Gable said, waving her into the house. Come in. It's chilly out." Alani stepped into Mrs. Gable's cozy living room, a space filled with antique furniture, family photos, and the scent of dried lavender. Mrs. Gable led her to a floral armchair and sat opposite her tool. "When I saw that policeman start to get aggressive," Mrs. Gable explained, "I thought to myself, no, this isn't right. My husband, Arthur, he was a journalist. He always told me, Eleanor, when you see an injustice, you don't turn away. You document it. So I grabbed this smartphone my son bought me, and I pushed the little red button." She picked up her phone from the table, her fingers slightly shaky with age, but surprisingly nimble as they swiped across the screen. "I'm not very good with this technology, but I know how to make a video." She turned the screen toward Alani. "Here it is." Alani held her breath as Mrs. Gable pressed play. The screen lit up with a slightly shaky, grainy image, filmed through a gap in the blinds, but the quality was good enough. The audio was surprisingly clear. She could hear her own voice, calm and controlled, and she could hear the provocative, sneering tone of Officer Miller. The video captured it all. Miller demanding her ID, the accusation of lurking, the taunts about her PhD and Kaiser's meanness. Then came the crucial moments. Alani watched herself give the sits command and saw Kaiser's perfect compliance. She heard Miller's threat to deal with Kaiser. She saw Miller advance, his hand moving toward his gun. The footage captured Kaiser's single warning huff, and then the pinnacle of control. Alani's own cold voice came from the phone's tiny speaker. "Kaiser Platz." She rewatched the image of her dog dropping to the pavement with deadly precision. She saw the confusion and defeat on Miller's face, clear even from this distance and through a pane of glass. The video continued, capturing the final verbal standoff, her threat to call 911, and the officer's hasty, defeated retreat. When the video ended, Alani looked up, tears streaming down her face. They weren't tears of sadness, but of overwhelming relief and profound gratitude. "Mrs. Gable," she said, her voice choked with emotion, You have no idea what this means. This is everything. Injustice is injustice, Alani, Mrs. Gable said simply, placing a hand on her arm, and it needs to be brought into the light. She smiled. Arthur would have been so proud. Alani immediately called her father again. Dad, she said the moment he picked up, you are not going to believe this. We have it. We have a video. There was a dead silence on the other end of the line, followed by a sharp exhale. Alani, Marcus said, his voice filled with an emotion she rarely heard. My God, tell that woman not to give that video to anyone. Don't post it online. Don't do anything. I'm sending someone to retrieve the original file immediately. This is our ace in the hole. We can't play it too early. Yes, I understand, Alani said. I'm canceling the private investigator, Marcus continued, his voice shifting into full strategic lawyer mode. We don't need him canvassing anymore. This video is more powerful than 100 witnesses. We're going to file the official complaint tomorrow morning. We'll attach your medical report, but we're going to hold back the video. We won't mention it. Why? Alani asked, surprised. Why not use it right away? Because, my daughter, Marcus explained, we are going to give them the rope. They will read your complaint and think it's just your word against 2 police officers. They'll get cocky. Miller and Davis will write their reports, full of lies to protect themselves. They'll say you were hostile, that your dog was a menace, that they were just following procedure. They are going to dig themselves into a very deep hole. Alani began to understand. And when they're completely trapped in their own lies, that's when we release the video, Marcus finished for her. At the hearing, in front of the disciplinary board, in front of their lawyers. We won't just prove them wrong. We will prove them to be liars. We will destroy their credibility beyond repair. It was a ruthless but brilliant strategy, a perfectly designed legal trap. Alani thanked Mrs. Gable again, her heart full of respect for this small but courageous woman. Mrs. Gable hadn't just been a witness. She had become an ally, a silent warrior in Alani's fight. Later that day, a special courier from Marcus's law firm collected a USB drive from Mrs. Gable containing the fateful video. 2 days later, just as Marcus had predicted, Alani received a formal letter from the Oak Creek Police Department. It acknowledged receipt of her complaint regarding an interaction with Officer Miller and Officer Davis. It also informed her that both officers had submitted detailed reports of the incident, stating that they had approached her due to suspicious behavior and had been forced to take action to ensure public safety due to a potentially dangerous canine and an uncooperative owner. Reading the lies written in black and white, Alani no longer felt anger. She felt only a cold pity. They had taken the bait. The trap was set. An internal hearing was scheduled for the following week. Alani, her father, Officer Miller, Officer Davis, their union lawyer, and a disciplinary board of 3 senior police department members would be present. In the days leading up to it, Alani tried to return to her normal life. She taught her classes, continued her research, and, of course, walked Kaiser every night on the same route. But now she walked with a different feeling, not fear, but defiance. This was her street, this was her neighborhood, and she would not be driven out. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. Alani wore a charcoal gray business suit, looking professional and composed. Her father, in his own expensive lawyer's suit, stood beside her, an imposing presence. As they walked into the conference room, she saw Miller and Davis, already seated on the other side of the table. Miller looked at her with a self-satisfied smirk. Davis avoided her eyes, staring down at the table. The game was about to begin, and Alani knew she was holding the card that would change everything. The fateful video sat quietly on her father's laptop, ready to be deployed, ready to demolish the wall of lies her opponents had so carefully constructed. The Oak Creek Police Department conference room was cold and impersonal, with bland beige walls and a long, polished wooden table. The air was thick with tension and adversarial energy. At one end of the table sat the 3 members of the disciplinary board, a captain, a lieutenant, and a lawyer representing the city. They sat with stoic, impartial expressions. On one side of the table were Officer Miller and Officer Davis, along with their union-appointed lawyer, a portly, middle-aged man named Peterson, whose smug expression suggested he believed this was a simple procedural matter. Miller sat up straight, his arms crossed, a defiant look in his eyes. Davis, in contrast, looked deeply uncomfortable. He fiddled with a pen, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. On the opposite side sat Alani and her father, Marcus Freeman. They sat with an almost preternatural calm. Captain Thompson, the head of the board, cleared his throat and began. "We are here today to review the complaint filed by Dr. Alani Freeman regarding an incident on the night of October 23rd involving Officer Miller and Officer Davis." He looked at Alani. "Dr. Freeman, we have read your complaint. We will now hear the officer's report." The lawyer, Peterson, stood up. "Members of the board, my clients acted professionally and followed protocol in what was a potentially dangerous situation." He gestured to Miller. Miller began to speak, his voice full of a practiced false confidence. He spun a completely fabricated version of the story. He said they had received multiple calls about a suspicious individual with a vicious pit bull-type dog. He claimed that when they approached Alani, she had become immediately hostile and belligerent, refusing to answer questions reasonably. Her dog, Miller continued, his tone dramatic, was growling and baring its teeth continuously. It was a clear and present danger. I repeatedly asked her to control the animal, but she refused. At one point, the dog lunged at me, and I prepared to defend myself, fearing for my safety. Alani just sat there, listening to the stream of lies pour from Miller's mouth. She remained impassive, but inside she felt a cold disgust. She glanced at Davis. He was still staring at the table, his face flushed. He knew it was a lie, but he remained silent. The blue wall of silence was holding firm. When Miller finished, Peterson turned to Davis. "Officer Davis, do you corroborate Officer Miller's testimony?" Davis looked up, and for a split second, his eyes met Alani's. She saw a conflict there, an internal struggle, but it lasted only a moment. He turned to the board. "Yes, sir," he mumbled. "That testimony is accurate." Alani's heart sank a little. She had harbored a naive hope that the younger officer might break ranks, but the pressure of the brotherhood, the fear for his career, had won. Now it was Peterson's turn to go on the offensive. He turned to Alani. "Dr. Freeman, is it not true that your dog is a large, powerful breed?" "Yes," Alani replied. "And is it not true that it was trained in the military, a violent environment?" "It was trained for obedience and discipline," Alani corrected. "A yes or no will suffice, Doctor," Peterson interrupted. "Was it trained for war?" "Yes," Alani conceded. Peterson smiled triumphantly, turning to the board. "There you have it, gentlemen. A hostile individual with a dog literally trained to kill. Our officers were faced with a credible threat. Their actions were not only reasonable but commendable." He sat down, looking smug. He believed he had won. So did Miller. They had successfully painted a picture of Alani as a dangerous troublemaker. Now it was Marcus Freeman's turn. He rose slowly, deliberately. He didn't look at the officers. He addressed the board directly. "Members of the board, we have just heard a story," he began, his voice a low, resonant baritone. "A story carefully crafted to fit a narrative. A story of an aggressive black woman and her dangerous dog. It's an easy story to tell, and for some, perhaps an easy story to believe." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "But there is a problem with that story. It is a complete and utter lie." Peterson jumped to his feet. "Objection! Counsel is making personal attacks on the officers." "I am not making personal attacks," Marcus said coolly. "I am stating facts, and I have proof." He turned back to the table, took out his laptop, and connected it to the large monitor on the wall. "Officer Miller, you just testified that my daughter's dog, Kaiser, was continuously growling and baring its teeth. Is that correct?" "That's right," Miller said, his confidence wavering slightly at this turn of events. "And you said it lunged at you?" "Exactly." "And Officer Davis, you corroborated this testimony?" Davis gave a weak nod. "Interesting," Marcus said. because what we're about to see tells a very different story. He pressed play. Mrs. Gable's video filled the large screen, clear and sharp. The room was utterly silent save for the audio from the recording. Every eye was glued to the monitor. They saw Miller approach Alani with his condescending attitude. They heard his provocations. They saw Alani's extraordinary composure. And then they saw Kaiser. They saw a dog that did not growl, did not bare its teeth. They saw it obey the Sith's command perfectly. They heard Miller's threat to deal with the dog. The Miller on the screen and the Miller in the room were two different people. On screen, he was the aggressor. In the room, his face was turning the color of chalk. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. Peterson was on his feet, his mouth open. What is this? Where did this video come from? It was provided by a concerned citizen who witnessed this gross abuse of power, Marcus said, his eyes never leaving the screen. The video played on. They saw Miller advance on Alani, his hand moving to his weapon. They heard Kaiser's single warning huff. There was no lunge. And then the moment of truth. Alani's cold, clear voice. Kaiser plots. The entire room, including the board members, seemed to hold its breath as they witnessed the dog's incredible display of discipline. They saw the baffled defeat on Miller's face. They heard the final exchange and watched the two officers retreat. When the screen went dark, a tomb-like silence filled the room. Marcus Freeman turned off the computer. He faced the board, his own face a mask of iron. "Members of the board," he said, his voice now like steel, "you not only have proof of misconduct and harassment, you now have irrefutable proof that these two officers have perjured themselves in an official internal investigation. They lied, not just in their reports, but here, in this room, to your faces. They have disgraced the uniform they wear." He turned to Miller and Davis. "Your credibility is destroyed. Your careers are over." Miller sat slumped in his chair, staring into nothing. The game was over. But then something unexpected happened. Officer Davis, who had been silent and ashamed throughout the hearing, suddenly stood up. Tears were in his eyes. He looked at the board, then at Alani. "What was in the video?" "That's the truth," he said, his voice breaking. "All of it. Officer Miller lied, and so did I. I lied because I was scared. I'm sorry. Dr. Freeman, I am so sorry." The confession, the shattering of the blue wall of silence, was more shocking than the video itself. It was a total surrender, an irretrievable admission of guilt. The judgment room had rendered its verdict, not by the board, but by the truth itself. Laid bare, brutal, and undeniable. Officer Davis's confession was like a bomb detonating in the tense silence of the room. It sent a shockwave whose aftershocks would travel far. Miller turned to stare at his young partner with an expression of pure disbelief, a mixture of rage and ultimate betrayal. The lawyer, Peterson, collapsed into his chair, his face ashen. All his earlier smugness vanished into thin air. He knew the case was not just lost, it was annihilated. Captain Thompson, the head of the board, looked shocked, but quickly regained his composure. He stared hard at Davis. "Officer Davis, do you understand the consequences of that statement?" "I do, Captain," Davis said, his voice steadier now, as if telling the truth had unburdened him of a terrible weight. "I'm prepared to accept them." Thompson nodded grimly. He turned to Miller. "Officer Miller, do you have anything to say?" Miller said nothing. He just sat there, a broken man, exposed by the truth and betrayed by the very person he assumed was his ally. His world view, built on power and lies, had crumbled around him. "This hearing is concluded," Thompson announced. "The board will convene and render its decision." Marcus Freeman signaled to Alani. They rose quietly and left the room, leaving behind the wreckage of two careers and a system that had just been exposed. As they walked out into the hallway, Alani felt an incredible sense of relief. The weight she had been carrying since that night seemed to have been lifted. "Did you know he was going to do that?" Alani asked her father. Marcus shook his head. "No, I just hoped. In every person, no matter how clouded by fear or prejudice, there is a spark of decency. Sometimes it just needs a hard enough push to shine through. A few days later, the official decision came down. Officer Miller was terminated immediately for gross misconduct, abuse of power, and perjury. Officer Davis was suspended for 6 months without pay and ordered to undergo extensive retraining in cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. The Oak Creek Police Department also issued a public apology to Dr. Alani Freeman and announced a series of reforms, including mandatory body-worn cameras for all patrol officers. The story didn't end there. It leaked to the press. At first, it was a small story in a local paper, but someone, perhaps a disgruntled person within the department, leaked Mrs. Gable's video to a national news network, and then it exploded. Within 24 hours, the video had millions of views. The hashtags at Justice for Alani and Kaiser the Hero were trending worldwide. Alani's story had touched a raw nerve in America, a nation grappling with issues of race and police reform. Alani was suddenly thrust into the spotlight. Calls from talk show producers, journalists, and book publishers flooded in. She became an unwilling icon of intelligent, controlled resistance. Kaiser became a star, too. The image of the dog in his disciplined, prone position in the face of an aggressive officer became a meme, a symbol of quiet strength. Animal welfare organizations and veterans groups celebrated him as a testament to the value of retired military working dogs. But the fame had a dark side. Alani received hateful emails and messages from Miller's supporters, people who called her a liar, a troublemaker, an anti-police agitator. They mobbed her on social media, trying to tarnish her reputation. But after what she had been through, the words of anonymous trolls felt weightless. She had faced a real threat. They couldn't scare her. She chose to handle the attention selectively. She agreed to a few interviews with respected journalists, using her platform to talk about the larger issues, implicit bias, the need for police accountability, and the importance of knowing your rights. She always stressed that her story was not about one bad apple, but about a system that allowed such behavior to exist and fester. Meanwhile, the fragments of the confrontation continued to affect others. Miller, fired and disgraced, vanished from public life. Davis, after his suspension, returned to the force, but he was a changed man. He was ostracized by many of his old colleagues for breaking the blue wall of silence, but he persevered, doing his job quietly and by all accounts becoming a better, more conscious officer. And then there was Mrs. Gable. The quiet, elderly woman was now hailed as a local hero. She received flowers and thank you cards. She told Alani she felt like her husband, Arthur the journalist, was smiling down on her. One evening, weeks after things had settled down, Alani and Kaiser were on their nightly walk. The same route. Everything looked the same, but Alani knew there was an invisible shift. She felt the eyes on her from the windows were no longer looks of suspicion, but of respect. Neighbors she had only exchanged pleasantries with before now stopped to chat, to ask about Kaiser, to say they were proud to have her in the neighborhood. The isolation she had felt that night had been replaced by a new sense of community. The confrontation hadn't just exposed hate, it had also awakened kindness and solidarity. As they passed a corner, a police cruiser approached. This time it was moving at a normal speed. As it passed them, the officer behind the wheel, a woman Alani had never seen before, looked at her, smiled, and gave a respectful nod. Alani nodded back. It was a small moment, but it meant the world. It didn't mean every problem was solved. It didn't mean racism had vanished from Oak Creek, but it was a sign of change, a flicker of hope. Alani looked down at Kaiser, her loyal companion. He looked up at her, his amber eyes bright in the streetlight. She knew their lives would never be the same. They had been thrown into a fight they didn't choose, but they had fought and won, not just for themselves, but for the countless others who had fought similar battles in silence. The earthquake was over, and from the fragments something new and stronger was beginning to be built. Alani and Kaiser's fame didn't just stay in the news cycle and on social media. It sent ripples into places Alani never expected. One afternoon, she received an email with an unusual subject line, "A thank you from a brother." The sender had a military-style name, no last name given. The email was short. "Dr. Freeman, I was Kaiser's original handler, or as we knew him, K9 Unit 734. I was with him in Kandahar. I saw the video of you and him. I wanted you to know that what you did, the way you handled yourself, and the way you trusted his training made all of us who served with him incredibly proud. You're not just his owner, you're his commander. Thank you for giving him a good life after his service and for having his back. If you ever need anything, our community is behind you. Semper Fi." Alani read the email over and over, tears once again welling in her eyes. She had never thought about Kaiser's past in this way, about the soldiers who had relied on him for their very lives. She realized her bond with Kaiser wasn't just between two individuals. It was part of a larger brotherhood, a camaraderie that transcended species. She replied to the email, expressing her profound gratitude, and it opened a door to a whole new world. She began receiving emails from other veterans who had worked with MWDs. They shared their own stories of courage, loss, and the unbreakable bond between handler and dog. Alani, the sociologist, was fascinated. She realized there was a bigger story here, one that needed to be told. She began a new research project, focusing on the relationship between veterans and their service dogs, and the challenges they both faced when reintegrating into civilian life. It gave her a new purpose, transforming her personal trauma into meaningful academic and social work. Meanwhile, another unexpected ally emerged. Her father called her one day. "Alani, you won't believe who just called my office." "Who was it?" "Officer Davis's lawyer." "What did he want?" Alani asked, a little wary. "He didn't want anything," Marcus said. "He wanted to make an offer. Davis wants to meet with you, alone. No lawyers, he just wants to talk." Alani hesitated. Part of her still felt the sting of Davis's initial silence, but another part was curious. He was the only other person besides her who had been there from beginning to end. He had seen it all. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think you should go," Marcus said, "but meet in a public place, and let me know where and when." Alani agreed. A meeting was arranged at a quiet coffee shop in the next town over. When she arrived, Davis was already there at a corner table, dressed in civilian clothes. He looked much younger and more vulnerable without the uniform. He stood up as she approached. "Thank you for coming, Dr. Freeman," he said awkwardly. "Call me Alani," she said, taking a seat. The first few minutes were stilted. Davis apologized again, and Alani accepted. Then she asked the question that had been on her mind. "Why? Why did you lie at first?" Davis sighed, looking down into his coffee. "Fear," he admitted. "Miller was my training officer. He was an influential guy at the department. I was a rookie. I was afraid that if I went against him, my career would be over before it even started. That blue wall of silence, it's real. The pressure is immense." "What changed your mind?" Alani asked. "The video," he said. "When I saw it on that screen, I saw the plain truth, and I saw myself. I saw a coward, and then I looked at you. You faced down Miller, his hate, all alone in the dark with just your dog. You had more courage than I did. I couldn't keep lying after seeing that. I didn't want to be that kind of cop. I didn't want to be that kind of man." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I know I can't take back what happened, but I want to do something right. I've started talking to other rookies in the department informally, telling them my story, telling them it's okay to speak up when they see something wrong. That silence just makes the problem worse." Alani was amazed. Davis wasn't just remorseful. He was actively trying to create change from within. He was turning his failure into a mission. They talked for nearly 2 hours. Alani told him about her new research project. Davis, as a police officer, offered her valuable insights into law enforcement culture. By the time they left, they were no longer adversaries. They had become unlikely allies, two people from different worlds, connected by one fateful night, both trying to find a way to heal and build something better from the wreckage. That meeting gave Alani a sense of peace she didn't expect. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but it freed her from the burden of her anger. Her story continued to spread, but now it had more nuance. It wasn't just a story of a victim and a villain, it was a story of redemption, of unexpected allies, and of the human capacity for change. A few months later, Alani held a small fundraiser at the university for her research project. She invited the veterans she had been in contact with, people from animal welfare organizations and community activists. On the day of the event, two guests arrived whom she didn't expect. The first was Mrs. Gable, bearing a tray of homemade cookies. The second was Officer Davis, out of uniform, standing discreetly at the back of the hall. He had come to show his support. As Alani stood at the podium to speak, Kaiser lying faithfully at her feet, she looked out at the crowd. She saw veterans, activists, professors, students, a brave widow, and a police officer seeking redemption. She realized that the confrontation on that dark street hadn't driven her into isolation. On the contrary, it had created a community, a network of unexpected allies, woven together by threads of truth, courage, and hope. And in that moment she knew she was no longer alone in her fight. Alani's research project flourished, gaining national attention from both academia and veterans organizations. She traveled the country, interviewing handlers and their canine partners, collecting stories of loyalty and healing. Kaiser often traveled with her, his quiet presence a living reminder of the powerful bond she was studying. It was on a trip to Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton in California, where she was interviewing a group of K-9 trainers, that something unexpected happened, an event that would illuminate a piece of Kaiser's past and connect Alani's story in a way she could never have imagined. After her interviews, she was invited to a small ceremony honoring a group of retiring MWDs. Standing in the crowd with Kaiser at her side, Alani watched the handlers with their four-legged partners. There was a profound dignity and affection in the air. When the ceremony concluded, a high-ranking officer, a colonel with salt and pepper hair and a stern face but kind eyes, approached her. "Dr. Freeman," he said, extending a hand, "I'm Colonel James Holloway. I've been following your story and your work. It's very impressive." "Thank you, Colonel," Alani said, shaking his hand. Colonel Holloway smiled, then his eyes drifted down to Kaiser, who sat quietly at Alani's side. The colonel's face suddenly changed. The professional friendliness vanished, replaced by a look of deep, shocked recognition. His eyes narrowed. "My God," he whispered, "it can't be." He knelt down, a surprising act for such a senior officer. He looked directly into Kaiser's eyes. The dog, normally wary of strangers, seemed strangely calm. He cocked his head slightly, his ears perked. "Kaiser," Colonel Holloway said, his voice trembling slightly. "K734, is that you, boy?" Kaiser let out a low, soft whine, a sound Alani rarely heard. He took a small step forward and gently licked the colonel's hand. Alani was stunned. You know him?" Colonel Holloway stood up, his eyes still fixed on Kaiser. "Know him? Doctor, I owe him my life." He told Alani a story. Years ago, when he was a lieutenant colonel in Afghanistan, his unit was ambushed in a remote village. The firefight was intense. Holloway was wounded, cut off from the rest of his team. He was pinned down behind a crumbling wall, bleeding, with a group of insurgents closing in. He thought it was the end. "And then," Holloway continued, his voice thick with emotion, "out of the smoke and chaos he appeared, K734. His handler had been hit, but he continued his mission. He threw himself between me and the attackers. He didn't just bark, he fought. He bought me the time my team needed to get to me. He saved me." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I was medevaced out. I always wondered what happened to that heroic dog. I'd heard he finished his tour with distinction and was retired." Alani stood there, completely floored. She had always known Kaiser was a hero, but to hear this specific story from the man who was saved brought a whole new dimension to her understanding of her companion. The dog who had stood between her and Officer Miller was the same dog who had stood between this colonel and certain death. His protective instinct, his unwavering loyalty, wasn't just something he was taught. It was who he was. But the surprise wasn't over. "Your story, Dr. Freeman," Colonel Holloway said. "It made bigger waves in the military community than you might think, especially after the video came out." "It did?" Alani asked. "Yes, and it reached some very influential ears." He gave her a meaningful look. "Are you aware that the Oak Creek Police Department received a sizable federal grant for their body camera program and de-escalation training?" "I read about that," Alani said. "I assumed it was part of a general reform package." Colonel Holloway gave a cryptic smile. "It was. But did you know who sits on the committee that allocates those grants at the Department of Justice?" Alani shook her head. "A retired 4-star general. A very good friend of mine, a man who heard the story of you and Kaiser from me personally just days after it happened. He was moved, to say the least, to learn that the dog who had once saved one of his officers was now in danger of being killed by another." It clicked for Alani. The reforms at the Oak Creek PD weren't just the result of her legal battle and public pressure. There were other forces at work behind the scenes, allies she never knew she had. The military's loyalty to one of its 4-legged heroes had extended far beyond the battlefield, influencing the corridors of power in Washington. "Your incident," Holloway concluded, "became a case study, a catalyst. It wasn't just about race. It was about honor, loyalty, and how we treat our heroes, both 2-legged and 4-legged. You started something much bigger than you realized, Dr. Freeman." Alani looked down at Kaiser. The dog stood there majestically, oblivious to the pivotal role he had played in a story so much larger than his own life. He was just a dog, doing what he was trained to do, what his instincts told him to do. But in doing so, he had changed lives, ended careers, and even helped reform a police department. This surprising truth wasn't a dramatic twist, but a quiet revelation. It showed her how interconnected the world was, in complex and invisible ways. An act of bravery on a distant battlefield years ago had echoed in a confrontation on a quiet suburban street. And that confrontation, in turn, had sent ripples back to affect the very power structures that created the circumstances in the first place. Alani felt a profound sense of humility. She had thought she was the driver of the story, but she now realized she, like everyone else, was just part of a much larger tapestry woven from threads of history, loyalty, and chance encounters. She patted Kaiser's neck. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." The dog looked up at her, and for a moment Alani felt that he understood. He had always understood. Years passed. The story of Alani and Kaiser slowly faded from the headlines, becoming a piece of history, a case study in law and sociology classes. Alani finished her book, The Echo of Loyalty, a critically acclaimed work that explored the profound bond between veterans and their canine companions. It cemented her reputation as a leading scholar in her field. She still lived in the house in Oak Creek. The street where the confrontation happened no longer carried the ghosts of the past. Instead, it had become a symbol of resilience. New neighbors who moved in were told the story, not as a warning, but as a point of community pride. Mrs. Gable passed away peacefully in her sleep, leaving Alani a collection of cookie recipes and a legacy of quiet courage. Officer Davis, now Sergeant Davis, was in charge of rookie training, where he emphasized empathy and accountability. He and Alani still had coffee sometimes, two unlikely friends bound by a shared history. And Kaiser, the hero dog, was old now. His gait was slower and his muzzle was white with age, but his amber eyes were still bright and wise. He spent most of his days sleeping in a patch of sun in the garden or lying next to Alani's desk as she worked. One autumn evening, much like the fateful night years ago, Alani and Kaiser were on their walk. The air was crisp, and the orange streetlights once again poured a liquid honey onto the sidewalk. Everything seemed the same, yet everything was different. As they reached the corner of Elm and Birch, a small child's bicycle lay abandoned on the sidewalk. A little girl of about 6, the daughter of a new family on the block, ran out from her yard to retrieve it. She saw Kaiser, and her eyes lit up. "Hi, big doggy," she chirped without a trace of fear. "Hello," Alani smiled. "His name is Kaiser." The girl boldly walked up and gently petted Kaiser's head. The old dog, who had faced down guns and hate, simply wagged his tail slowly and nudged his head into her small hand. The girl's mother came to the door. "Mia, don't bother our neighbors," she called out. Then she recognized Alani. "Oh, Dr. Freeman, I'm so sorry." "It's no bother at all," Alani said. "We're happy to say hello." The mother smiled. "We heard the story about you and Kaiser. It's an honor to be your neighbor." After the girl and her mother went inside, Alani and Kaiser continued their walk. Alani looked down at her companion. Years ago, on this very street, their presence had been deemed a threat. Now they were a beloved, respected part of the community. They were no longer outside the circle of safety. They had become its center. They hadn't changed the neighborhood. They had helped the neighborhood change itself by forcing it to confront its own prejudices. As they neared their home, Alani felt a deep sense of peace, a feeling she once thought she might never have again. It wasn't the naive peace of ignorance. It was the earned peace that comes from having faced down danger and won. It was the peace of strength. She realized then that my promise at the beginning of this story was a lie. I said I would take away your sense of safety, but that wasn't the ultimate goal. The goal was to shatter a false sense of safety and replace it with something real, something earned, a safety based not on ignorance but on awareness, courage, and community. This story wasn't just about a black woman and her dog confronting racist cops. It was about finding strength in discipline, finding allies in the most unexpected places, and realizing that one single act of courage can send ripples out that change the world around you. So you've heard it all. A long journey, wasn't it? Thank you for staying with me. The story of Alani and Kaiser reminds us that the most important battles aren't always fought on distant fields of war. Sometimes they're fought on our own sidewalks. And the most powerful weapons aren't guns, but truth, discipline, and a loyal friend at your side. If this story reached you, if it made you think, if it gave you a flicker of hope, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because there are so many more stories that need to be told, so many more voices that need to be heard. This channel is where those stories come to life. And remember this as you turn this video off and go back to your world. Safety isn't a place, it's a struggle. And that struggle is never really over.